Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Therapy Talk. Today I have a really special guest. I'm really excited about it. Janelle Patterson from the Marietta Times. And the interesting story behind this is that we're friends on social media, and I was scrolling through and I saw that she posted something reading a book called The Body Keeps Score, which is by Bessel van der Kolk, which is a trauma expert, psychiatrist, and I was kind of taken back because typically you don't see people not in the field read such a book like that. So I reached out and said we need to talk and just have conversations and talk about trauma, as trauma has always been my kind of emphasis in the work that I do, but also I think an important issue for people in the public to kind of understand more about it. So thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, yeah.
Yeah, so I appreciate it. So I'm curious as to what kind of made you, or how did you come across that book? What was kind of the story behind that?
Okay, well, that book, so this year has been interesting, I think, for everybody. We've had a lot of, I feel like this year has not stopped. And at the same time that January feels like yesterday, it also feels like 100 years ago. Mm-hmm. So I had spent much of this year reflecting as you're hitting all of these different news stories, and we've talked about COVID fatigue, and people are kind of just done with whatever is going on and are starting to numb and tune out. And I was watching similar patterns that I've seen in other stories and in other circumstances where I've talked with different people, and just kind of was thinking through conversations that I've had over the past couple of years about generational trauma and epigenetics, both in my professional and personal life. Right. And actually, I was just thinking about this, and it came across on Amazon. I was like, okay, rude. First of all, like, get out of my brain.
Another stressor, like, how do you know what I'm thinking?
could you not? That was.
How are you so intuitive?
Right, exactly, yeah.
You mentioned some patterns, so I'm curious as to kind of what patterns you've been noticing. The Body Keeps Score really talks about kind of the body and how it kind of holds on to those traumas and the memories. There's anything that kind of really kind of stuck out to you, or you saw concern about in terms of those patterns? In kind of watching how people interact or have pushed each other away this year. I mean, not only have we had a pandemic, we've had a very stressful election cycle on both sides of the aisle, and even in local politics. There's a lot of just triggering moments where people seem so on edge that it doesn't take a lot. And I'm watching it. I sit in meetings and I watch body language, and I watch the way people choose to interact or accept somebody else's critique, or physically move their own body away from them, right, or withdraw. And so just trying to understand that. I mean, you can read children sometimes easier, but I was watching the same behaviors that I see in kids, or that I've seen in kids as I've babysat for a couple of decades. Instead, you're watching adults do this. And so it piqued my interest. Why are people almost reverting and not being completely present to like separate I don't like you from I don't like what you're talking about? Yeah. One of the things I hear you saying that I think is interesting is most people, when they think of trauma, they think of like these big T's, like sexual abuse, physical abuse, domestic violence, which are huge traumas and definitely have an impact. But then we also have these little T's, and just how it affects our, just something that happens in our life that changes the trajectory of where we're going. So COVID or the election kind of, intensifies things for us. And then all of a sudden we're more reactive and we're more, it's harder for us to deal with stuff. And we get like really kind of overwhelmed easily. Trauma is stress. We have a lot of health problems as a result because we're holding on to these traumas. I'm curious as you're reading, was there anything that kind of really stood out to you, or something that you learned that you're really dealing with trauma?
Multiple spots within the books, but kind of watching and again listening, I think was also more key for me in realizing, here's somebody that's treating patients that is also still learning from them. You know, and I could identify with that. You know, I'm not treating anybody by any stretch. I'm documenting, I'm trying to create understanding, oftentimes I'm teaching.
Does it give you a different perspective on how you report, do you think?
Definitely. Especially in the past couple of years, we've seen a rhetoric change about news media. One that I think has always existed. I don't think we created anything new just because of one election cycle or 2 election cycles. But, you know, started to see how many people seem to fear even talking with me, whether it was expressed as anger or distrust, or like it all seemed very rooted in fear and how are you going to use me and twist my words. I don't know if I can even claim that I was taught in school how to calm that fear. You know, it wasn't like, hey, here's a calming fear class. Here's how to get your sources to trust you. That doesn't exist. I mean, what existed is understanding what's important in news by hierarchy, and how to construct your story, and how to keep people involved and understand that at any point, especially if you're writing for print, you run out of space. So did you get all the most important information up front? And so, and granted, all of these rules are then meant to be broken at some point. There's a reason to break them at some point. But you know, you leave school and you go into communities and you're the enemy. And I remember thinking, I'm 5'2".
Right.
Like, I'm not that scary of a person. Like, I could be cute. I could come sit and talk with you, but like, I'm not scary. So trying to understand that, I mean, it always kind of came down to how do we connect? Are we breaking bread and talking about our family lives? Are we singing a hymn together at your piano? You know, when you're screaming at me that I'm the fake news and, you know, this is this big conspiracy, can I remind you about the time that we were, you know, crushing a car together and you were cracking up that I was wearing Doc Martens and just giggling?
Right.
But that creates a shared sense of community or tribe that, like, I'm a part of your life more than just the one time I talked to you. You know, and whether it was your grandchild that I put in the paper because they did some great service project, or it was us talking about how to sign up for the Affordable Care Act and get your insurance. I always have wanted to be a part of the community that I've served. Yeah. Yes, I am still employed to investigate. I'm still employed to hold accountable, and that's uncomfortable.
Right.
And I have to continuously remind people that I'm not paid to be your friend, but I do live in your community. And so I'm also impacted. I'm also affected in the same ways, potentially with a little bit more access to answers.
So have those experiences affected the way you approach certain stories, or has it, I mean, in just thinking of The Body Keeps Score, have you felt that differently in terms of, you know, those experiences and how it might kind of shape things?
Yeah, it definitely, it impacts kind of how you ask your questions. So with like veterans, I'll have, some veterans cannot have a face-to-face conversation with you. Looking you in the eye is incredibly uncomfortable and feels like they're getting backed into a corner. Yeah. And they can't do it. Like, I mean, I've seen them shut down entirely. Right. Those same veterans, though, are much more willing to talk over the phone or over a meal. Right. And you don't have to maintain eye contact, or you know, if I'm coming into an interview, I'm not writing anything down. I'm there, I'm cataloging things in my brain. All right, this is how their body moved, and I'll go and I'll sit in the car afterward and make sure that I have those notes, but I record the interview instead.
Right.
Others, it's just sitting with them. You know, there was a couple of years ago an older gentleman who was assaulted. Like pulled out of his vehicle and beaten on the road.
Right.
And I sat through the court hearings and was, you know, kind of piecing together, how the heck did this happen? And this gentleman wanted to sit with me and kind of talk. He didn't want to talk about what happened.
Sure.
He wanted to pray. And I remember sitting there just in tears.
Right. That's very powerful.
All he wanted to do was pray for the guy that had beat the crap out of him.
Right.
And you're like, okay, so these are complex emotions. This is being what they need in that moment while still documenting why anybody else should care. And seeing humanity in other types of people or in other experiences. So.
Well, you're a storyteller.
Yes.
And you're trying to share stories that are important that require for people to share, and this is the same in treatment, for people to share those stories honestly and openly, they have to feel safe. One of the things we talk about in the work we do with trauma is working parallel. So not working face to face because of how activating that can be for our stress response. That, you know, our brain is constantly looking for threat in the world. It's constantly appraising the world to survive. And, you know, when we experience trauma, we're a little bit more sensitized to things. So look, body positioning, you know, things that are said, things that remind us kind of those traumas. So we can be very reactive to things that, like, if you're talking face to face to a veteran, your intention is not to hurt him, but his brain is telling him, that's too much for me. I can't. I can't. And his body is signaling to him, or his brain, body, you know, you need to kind of
shut it down.
Shut it down.
Shut it down.
That's how you're going to protect yourself. And I think so. That's a very powerful thing in terms of, you know, we always hear is like, how can someone who's not their therapist help and support folks that are dealing with things like trauma? You know, and you just identified that as doing something with them or talking, you know, side by side, not face to face, and things like that. That can be a very powerful. You're trying to kind of balance being genuine and human with the people you report on, but also telling the story.
Yeah, and documenting in different ways. So like when interacting with children, no kid or really adult ever likes being talked down to, right? So it's something as simple as changing body position. You know, if the child is yay high, I'm not going to stand and talk to them.
Right.
You know, I'll sit down or I'll crouch down or I'll even try and get lower because that's more comfortable. Then they're in control or have a feeling of control that means that they have a way out or a way to move. You know, likewise, when you're sitting talking with someone who's experienced or is continuing to experience what feels like their life is unraveling. I'm not going to sit in a corner or stand in the corner of their house as they're telling me about how they haven't had heat in months. I'm gonna sit. Right. We're going to be there with them, literally on their level. And, you know, when things feel too intense, maybe it's time to move to a different topic for a little bit. You know, tell me about what's going on at home, or tell me about what are you excited about, or why do you love your kid? You know, just to reassert or reset that, like, this is not spiraling, this is not out of control, you're going to be okay. I'm
not going to keep pushing somebody past their breaking point. I'm going to pay attention. And so a lot of lessons can be learned from that, is, you know, especially in terms of if I push people beyond their breaking point, or if I push them to where they are going to shut down, then I'm not being very effective in communicating my point of view. And I'm hurting people, or I'm creating a situation that, you know, is not healthy or helpful. And ultimately is, can we create a space where we can talk about these things and learn from those experiences? Because I would imagine that praying with that person that was dealing with that trauma, that was a pretty strong learning experience for you about healing and forgiveness.
Yeah. I'm paid to hold accountable. that is the main role of the fourth estate, is accountability to those in power. Whether you're in government or you're in a position of an organization that has impact on other people's lives, or you're a private resident who's impacting your neighbors because of your actions or inaction. So I can't always make you comfortable.
Right.
You know, that there are times when I have to push, because my first loyalty is to my community. How do we bring you along so you understand that this is a greater impact? At the same time, when you want to be combative, how do I not react? I can respond and refocus, but I can't be escalating what you're escalating, and I have to keep charging through sometimes. if your actions are impacting other people, I can't let you keep evading. I have to stop you and get an answer or prove that you're refusing to answer. That's part of the role of holding accountable. And it's an act of love for you and for the community.
Right.
I'm not going to let you get away with continuing the lie, even if you're lying to yourself.
Well, and so when we kind of experience trauma and our difficulty in being able to deal with that, we can end up doing things that are affecting other people. And so how do we help people kind of recognize the impact they have on others so that it can inform change? You know, there's the goal, it sounds like, you know, of holding people accountable is not just to say, I caught you.
No.
It's to say there needs to be kind of change here because of how it's affecting the community, and how can we do that? Understanding
that by virtue of your responsibility, of your power, of your privilege, ethically you are bound to more. You know, you're bound to work through whatever negative reaction you have. And then cognitively find a response. I think we see that in coming to terms with trauma. There's still impact. Yes, we can forgive you for having lashed out at somebody. But what happens after you say, I'm sorry? Do you change? Do you do anything different?
Well, and if you were kind of, and I don't know if you've gotten through your book or not, the idea of our body keeping score, or our body having these memories, and our body influencing our actions, a lot of times that's without our awareness.
Oh yeah.
So we don't really know why we're reacting the way we are, but we are. And so sometimes the hardest part about healing is facing those events that have created these kind of imprints in our brain and body that, you know, seem to influence the way we perceive things, the way we interact with other people or don't interact with people, the way we, you know, shut down and disconnect from people, you know, all those types of things kind of are impacted by these traumas that live and are imprinted in our being. And so oftentimes there's probably elements of that you see in a daily basis of reporting, where you're trying to kind of hold that person accountable, and they're who they are based on those imprints. And it's hard to kind of get that shift, that change.
It's a weird balance.
It is a weird balance.
It's a very weird balance. To watch the body language and try in that very moment to adjust, and still, okay, but you're not answering the question. I can rephrase the question 14 different ways. If you're still not getting to the meat of what needs to be known, at some point the patience has to end. We can understand, you know, why a parent has lashed out at their children and still not condone you beating the crap out of your kid. So I can be both empathetic and understanding and need to stop what's happening.
Well, and if healing is to occur, if people are willing to go down that road, there has to be some level of understanding for that person. You know, that safety, you know, because am I gonna go face this really challenging road of healing and change? That is a challenge, because people that are in a place of helping have to wrap their head around the idea of, I'm not okay with what was done. The issue is not to kind of highlight all the people that are doing bad things. Focus on helping, and some of that requires facing difficult things and having difficult conversations. The example of the person praying, you know, there's a lot of things that person must have really had to kind of wrap their head around and face. How do I manage my severe pain and forgive at the same time? It's a very powerful story of healing.
Yeah, that, and I've seen that in different ways. You know, I've seen that with a local veteran who hadn't shared any of their experiences until, you know, we sat and just talked without having to feel shame. You know, something that he had felt incredible shame for from the time that he returned back to the United States and had thrown his uniform in a trash bin, to all of the other experiences that had refused to think about. You know, we've had multiple conversations kind of in different settings, but all from a point of, you know, that brotherly love we talk about, you know, in John, you know, love one another, and love taking different forms. So the reason I reference this veteran is I ended up, after the second or third time that I interviewed him, going and getting a book that his experiences were reminding me of, The Giver by Lois Lowry. I remember books from my childhood pretty vividly, different scenes. And the scene of the child giving the pleasant memories to the baby as they're, you know, trying to keep him quiet and getting away from the search parties and everything, and how that was relieving, and it was less of a burden for him too, because as he got further away with this child, the negative experiences were also filtered back. I mean, it's kind of science fiction, but filtered back into the community, and the community had to deal with them. I was watching a visible change in this veteran as from the first time we talked, and the conversation was mostly on shame. Mostly tears, mostly shame, isolation. And by the second, third, fourth iterations, where he'd continued to share stories he hadn't shared with his family, there was less. There was less of a burden, able to show up at events more and be present and not feel cornered or isolated, even in a group setting. You know, actively seeking to come and give me a hug rather than, you know, oh, the camera, like, let me hide. Right. Let me, because you can watch that in people's bodies, you know, how they watch and interact with even just your presence in the room. You're able to watch their own realization of, I am here, and I'm seen, and I'm safe, and I'm loved.
It is way better of a society to love and care for others than to hate and, you know, avoid people. So just as much as negative events can shape and create that shame, that avoidance, that shrinking of who you are and things like that, you know, so love can do the opposite. It can allow for openness and being, you know, present and being able to engage with people. It's a sense of safety and community and love, and you know, when you're around that, that's very uplifting than when you are, you know, around people that are kind of tense and stressed, and that negative energy you're saying that kind of goes back into the community.
I've seen it also too with people who choose to serve together, even when they don't know what they're doing. You know, like they just want to be together, and you start to see groups of individuals become more comfortable around people that aren't the same as them. When they pick a goal and just do it. You know, it's not what they're doing to serve really doesn't matter. Frankly, I mean, you can do any type of service, whether it be mulching or collecting cans together.
Right.
In having that action together, you're starting to create those bonds where there would have otherwise been other.
Well, nothing can bring people together of different races, ethnicities, cultures, experiences than a common goal that you're working towards. I mean, you see that in sports, you see that in, you know, a lot of different settings where it's like, you know, we're working for the same goal or same mission or value or purpose. And then, you know, all of a sudden those differences start to kind of not be so scary or unfamiliar. We start to kind of connect and be a part of something.
The more you can have some common bases, the more comfortable, you know, I have a colleague who says, all right, we need to have a talk, and this needs to be a safe space.
Right.
You know, and we can have that conversation without flying off the handle or getting super defensive, because we know we have an underlying love.
Right. Can you sit down with me and listen to what I have to say before you want to react and say something back?
Yeah. Like, can you hear without invalidating that what you're doing is hurtful?
And I think a lot of times we assume intent based on the behavior or based on how we're feeling about that, and we end up kind of having these really negative reactions and arguments and fights over things that's like, wait, whoa, I didn't, what's going on here?
That doesn't seem to...
Right, I wasn't meaning for that to happen, and it kind of explodes. In most instances, I'm sure there are times where people have bad intentions, but in most instances we're trying to address some type of concern we have, or we have a certain intention that we're trying, but maybe it didn't go the way we
didn't communicate it the right way, or in a way that, because unfortunately we don't have like a crystal ball
right.
to be like, all right, so Doug, he's had these 4 traumas, which means I can't say those words,
right.
but I can say these words.
Because what ends up happening is, when we experience those traumas, anything that resembles those traumas, we try to avoid. That's a symptom of trauma, is avoidance. We don't want to re-experience it because it feels awful. And we have these awful experiences in our body, and we're like, I don't want to feel that again. So we avoid and avoid and avoid. And then that leads to a lot of, other self-destructive things, substance use, self-harm, all these types of things to get rid of that uncomfortable sensation in our body. And so that's really how kind of trauma really impacts us, is where the trauma memory hasn't really been fully processed and filed away in our memory banks, in our long-term memory. It is like right there, active, ready to sound the alarms when we're seeing somebody that looks like the person that traumatized us, or sounds like it, or we're in a neighborhood, or whatever. And so what ends up happening is we as professionals sometimes do that. Well, you can't talk about these things because they're traumatizing. We can't talk about these things, but then what we're doing is we're giving actually more power to that trauma memory. One of the trauma models that he certainly stands by is this trauma model called EMDR, eye movement desensitization reprocessing, which is it sounds kind of weird, but it really is just a kind of finding a way to process trauma memories in a way of basically taking that memory and kind of really filing it away, and kind of distancing the intensity of that memory, so that we don't have to kind of be controlled or hijacked by these reminders and things like that. But it's something as simple as like, okay, if you were assaulted by somebody of a certain gender, then okay, you can't have a therapist that's of that gender because that's going to remind. But then we're creating this association that all men or all women are bad, or and we kind of avoid those opportunities to kind of rechange that association that our brain makes. And so it's kind of happens even with your reporting. So we get traumatized by certain ways. Maybe people in your field or in the field have reported, or the kind of the talk soup of politics or journalism that affects. So you get generalized, you get grouped into, there was an article that we didn't like that you wrote years ago, but then you're always kind of leads to those kind of generalizations and assumptions that it's, instead of being present and saying, okay, what's happening here? How can I gain more understanding about what's going on?
We can forget, or we can put aside when we're looking at political discourse on a local, national, regional level, that a person is able to change their mind, or is able to see, you know what, I did believe that, and I had reasons for believing that, and I have added to my information, I've added to my repertoire, and now I'm shifting. I may not be shifting my values, but I may be shifting how I go about finding solutions. I had a pretty visceral reaction from a politician over the phone, and it was kind of shocking. I'd had a pretty good relationship for several years, and had a good, working understanding. These are the things that motivate them. These are the things that they're passionate about. These are the things we share. Experiences that we can draw upon and share when we maybe don't agree. And then I had this almost visceral reaction of, you're part of this conspiracy. You're, this terrible human. And sitting there thinking, okay, something has happened. And to be able to step back and say, I cannot identify a moment where what you're saying about me is true. I could be completely wrong.
Right.
So what I had the opportunity to do in that moment is react and also be hurt and be aggressive and or to pause and say, can you point to an instance where you feel that I've done this? And what specifically about that? Because I mean, if I need to correct something, I'll correct something.
Right.
But I need a more specific instance than just a generalization of
Sure.
You're the devil. Kind of made it through that phone call, and I went on to a couple other things that evening. And it was on the back of my mind, but I'm thinking, we weren't able to nail down an instance, so I'm not going to take that personally right now. I can revisit that, and maybe we can, try and come back with cooler heads and figure out what was going on there. But that's not really about me right now. And then I had the request in the middle of another meeting later, can I call you back? Thinking, all right, well, I may be getting yelled at again. I'm not real sure what this is, but sure. I mean, I can take it. I may need to call my mom later and just kind of vent and kind of let it out. Yeah, feel like, all right, I'm getting this right now. But sure, yeah, you can give me a call back. I'll be free in, an hour or so. There was a marked shift in tone of voice and some clear reflection, that wasn't about you. And that was pretty much the whole conversation was that wasn't fair to you. I apologize. That wasn't about you. We have had a good relationship.
Right.
But had I reacted, I never would have gotten to that. He never would have gotten to that. We wouldn't have had that type of a dialogue to come back to and then to continue to have a good relationship thereafter. I mean, like you say, there's some awareness, oh, okay, my body's getting tense. Is this about me? Am I actually under fire? Or am I okay?
Right.
Thankfully, for that particular interview, I was in a spot where I knew I would have quiet. I knew I wouldn't be overstimulated.
Right.
I knew that I was safe.
Yeah. It was much better to be on the phone doing
that conversation
than
yes.
to be in person. So.
Yeah, or to feel like there are multiple people that are coming at you at the same time. There's, you kind of have to pick your battles, pick your moments of, okay, I'm getting yelled at in a courthouse. There's a different scenario. Or as opposed to, I'm getting yelled at, but I'm in a spot where, no, everything's going to be fine.
To really have breakthrough, I mean, you have to be regulated and feel safe. And so it wasn't until that second conversation where, cooler heads prevail kind of thing. But okay, now that I walk away from that previous call, I'm realizing it wasn't what I thought or whatever. And typically that's what happened. If you had reacted and yelled back, it just reaffirmed.
Right, but yes, this is adversarial.
This is the way it is. To stay regulated in that time and say, can you point out those situations and not be in a more threatening of a situation? For whatever reason, he had a valid or he had a reasonable concern about why he was upset. Doesn't necessarily mean that you did anything wrong or whatever, but there was something that was bothering him.
To balance is the way that you're behaving linked to an action, linked to a feeling? Do you feel threatened? Are you worried about being found out? Sometimes, especially when people are put in new positions of power, I've noticed that a common fear is, I don't want to look like I'm dumb, or that I don't know what I'm talking about. And so they'll just kind of spout off out the mouth and end up digging a deeper hole.
Right.
And so
that sense of vulnerability makes us more aroused in terms of stress. So we're more activated and less in control of ourselves. We're less able to think critically or be thoughtful about what we say, and we're more in a reactive kind of way, which happens.
You tend to make broader statements or more, way more verbose than you need to be. Especially in my generation, we kind of get taught that, people are going to assume you're young, assume you don't know what you're talking about. Okay, so if they assume you don't know what you're talking about, that leads to, well, I know what I'm talking about, and you get super defensive. But the reiteration is you get punished for not knowing instead of, I don't know, I'll find out.
Right.
Or I need to look into that. Or that's not coming to mind, can I get back to you?
Right.
You know, and not be punitive because we're human. There's nothing wrong with not knowing everything.
Mm-hmm. The more stress we get, the more rigid we get, the more we hold on to kind of things that are not necessarily helpful. And so we get caught and trapped in this situation that we feel like we can't back down or get out of.
We get so held on to, you know, this is my faith, or this is because I said so, or because taxes are bad, or, you know, whatever that one thing you're holding on to, logic can't break through to help you formulate thought. I worry often that people don't take the time to reflect and find the words. And I mean, that's a byproduct, I think, in part too, of a never-ending news cycle, that you have to have the words pretty quickly. But having the opportunity to both be accountable for the words that were hurtful that you said in the moment, or the words that were impactful, whether it was hurt or not, that had an impact on somebody else's life or job or ability to provide for their family, especially in areas where there's chronic trauma, where things have not stopped, whether it's 1 year, 10 years, 20 years, and it seems like you're just getting beaten up all the time. When do you have moments to stop and reflect on impact?
Right.
And start to choose to be in that discomfort. You don't have to stay, I think that's where I was pulling to. You don't have to stay there, but you don't have to leave either.
Right.
You're just now using it as information. You're curious about cause, effect. Why do I feel this way? When this happens? Is there a pattern in my own life? And then not necessarily changing, but understanding that that is a pattern for you.
Doing that without judgment, I think, is kind of where we're at with that. And, you know, ultimately, the more stressed we get, or the more stressed reactions we hang out in, the less ability we have to reflect. So if we're not calm, then it's really hard to reflect, because what ends up happening with our brain is that when our brain perceives threat, you know, a reporter talking about an article that is going to be maybe detrimental to something, or seeing somebody that reminds me of a past trauma, or any of these types of things, whether they're really threatening or not, if my brain perceives it to be threatening, then my brain only focuses on getting away from that threat. So my ability to self-reflect goes away, because that's not helpful in survival.
Right, yeah.
Like, so if I'm thinking about how my day went, or what I'm doing wrong, or what I might be needing to change, my ability to do that goes away when I am fearing some type of threat, internally or externally. Internally within myself, like a memory, or externally there's somebody in my environment. You know, I'm being chased by a tiger. You know, if you're being chased by a tiger, you don't want to sit there and kind of go,
how many stripes are on that tiger?
Right. So your number one priority is to escape that trauma. And so typically the way that looks is fighting, running away, you know, disconnecting from the world, you know, all those things to try to escape and get rid of that feeling.
So either physically or mentally escaping what's happening in that moment.
Yeah, so those attacks that happen on that phone call is, you know, that person was threatened in some way, whether it's real or not. You know, the brain's gonna, certainly if we've experienced a lot of traumas and toxic stress, our brain's gonna be more sensitized to things being more threatening. It's going to filter the way we process information. We're going to see a look that is really means nothing, but take it as being threatening. You know, you looked at me weird. Why did you do that? And, you know, it's my brain is on high alert, and so that's where trauma can really create problems. It's not a defect in the person. It is the brain's attempt to stay alive. And so it is, you know, because of these events that, you know, in trauma-informed care, we always talk about the best question is, what has happened to you? Not what is wrong with you. It's how have these experiences that you've had, these traumas, and for military veterans, things that are not threatening, but are perceived by the brain to be threatening. And so we have these attacks and yelling and things like that, running away or disconnecting from the world.
I'm more curious too on the disconnect. It almost would seem that conscience shuts down, and I'm just doing my job. Like there's almost a refusal to see impact. But I watch and I think, what is happening? Like why can you not even acknowledge anymore? Whether it's the question or whether it's the impact on other people, something shuts down and it doesn't exist now.
Right. You kind of go what we would call like this dissociative, like this robotic compliance, like telling people what they want to hear or telling people something to get them off their back or whatever. We're in this freeze state in a sense where we're just kind of like, leave me alone, I'm good. Like, there's nothing wrong, or I'm just doing my job, or any of those things. And even more specifically, the brain prefers what's familiar to what's good, so we just stick with what we're used to, we stick with what we're comfortable with, and it's not always good for us.
Yeah.
So we think in similar ways because that's what's familiar, and to think differently is a challenge because it's uncomfortable, it's unfamiliar. It is seen as threatening to our well-being or integrity and things
I'm not
like
good
that.
at this, so I could get it wrong.
Right. And so vulnerability and shame are really huge in terms of trauma, and things that we have to work through with clients is getting them to handle that shame and work through that shame and reframe that shame, because a lot of times that shame is just too destructive for us.
I've witnessed an overdose.
Mm-hmm.
And oh gosh, no class in journalism school
prepares you for that.
Prepares you for blue lips and foam in the mouth and sheet white skin. Mm-hmm. And after that moment, you're documenting what happened. You're documenting who was there. You're documenting time frame and colors and surroundings, and then you go back and you're figuring out who this individual is. And in that instance, there was a unique opportunity to then talk with the individual who OD'd because they were revived.
Right.
And so to talk with them about what was going on during the day without saying, well, why'd you stick a needle in your arm?
Right.
Which... that doesn't help anybody. Just like you don't ask a veteran, how many people have you killed?
Right.
That is never going to be helpful. And in fact, probably more harmful.
Right.
Many of the veterans I talk with talk about how they're not comfortable talking with most people because that's one of the first questions out of somebody's mouth. Or that's a fear that they have that's going to be the question. So
they kind of automatically shut it down before the conversation starts because
exactly, because we're never going to go there.
Yeah, that's a protective kind of measure, yeah.
Right. So instead talking about what was happening that day, or who are you going home to, removes some of that threat. Mm-hmm. In that instance, it was talking about children or talking about the people that were there to keep your airways open until the ambulance got there. That. Well,
and the why did you do it is a shame-inducing question.
Right.
So
that was never the question.
What is wrong with you? Why did you do something like that? Is more of
how could
you possibly do that?
What is
exploring
so
their
off?
day and what was going on in the context of the situation. There's context to everything. Is really important. That's important in terms of also people, that have loved ones that have done something like that and they don't understand it. It doesn't make sense to them. They're scared, things like that. How can they be, supportive and helpful in that moment, or not reactivating for that person, so we can kind of find that path for healing.
And our responses are always watched, especially by younger individuals around us. Mm-hmm. I can recall being much younger, being around some church leaders and hearing how they would critique somebody else's journey. And I mean, those conversations don't leave. They haven't left my head in years. You started from such a place of judgment and you don't have any context. You call it, oh, they're running a marathon, just checking boxes off. You have no idea why that person is training as hard as they are, or what they're dealing with, or why that's helpful for them. I mean, we're not just one story. We have so many that inform who we are, yes, I get the opportunity to tell pieces of people's stories.
How can we be just open to the person, the story, the understanding? And we go back to understanding and compassion
and having the courage to listen. It's not always going to be comfortable.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you know, I have a pretty hardy grandfather, my abuelo, who life's not fair. Suck it up, you know, like, and we have, I've seen that especially in the Mid Ohio Valley, like we've got a certain grit here that it's not gonna be fair, you know, and so why can't we also almost internalize it that, like, understanding somebody else in that moment isn't always going to be enough.
Our ability to heal is within our own self. People really are going to kind of be our supports to finding that healing and being able to seek that out. So sometimes what the coolest thing about our world and just about life, that moment where you were just being with that person praying could have been a moment that just changed the trajectory of that person's life and healing occur. So that one moment where you take the second to just listen could be the moment where that person's life turns around. We are our experiences, we're shaped by our experiences. And so if, like you were saying, if the message is always judgment, then that's gonna shape who we are. It's gonna shape our internal compass and our internal world. If there's a lot of listening and just reflecting and understanding, then that's going to also shape our world and who we are and how we relate to people and things like that. So
that's a lesson, I think, too, for old school journalists. Like, we have your who, what, when, where, why, how. Mm-hmm. Like that is the basis of getting out 12 inches of copy. Sometimes your best stories don't lead with that anymore. Mm-hmm. You know, sometimes it's being able to create that context. And then sometimes you don't, like, you need to have something more quick. You need to have the who. So there's a balance. Mm-hmm. There's a balance between, yes, there's context, but also there's a faster impact. You know, if your words are permeating quickly or getting shared hundreds of times, I mean, social media, we're able to disseminate reaction so much faster without ever having a reflective moment. You know, there's more to be accountable for. Being able to react in your journal and then go back and read your journal and say, okay, I can see why I felt that way, and maybe I still feel that way, but I have some greater evidence to back it up, or while I feel that way privately, you know, professionally, I can still work with this person.
Well, and maybe that's, you know, sometimes in traumas, people can grow stronger from it and people can learn from it, and it's not an easy place to get people to, but it can be there. There's tons of stories that we see out in the world of people that have experienced, you know, difficult, challenging traumas and have come out, you know, stronger and in a place of healing, allowing ourselves to kind of reflect without judgment and learn from our experience, so that we can keep moving forward in a positive direction. We could probably talk for.
We could probably keep going.
Right, we could probably keep going, and we I think I really appreciate you spending the time and sharing your experience, both from just learning about trauma, but also from your journalism background and approach to reporting and how those worlds tend to kind of intermingle. So I appreciate it. Thanks everybody for joining us. Look forward to many more, and have a good week.